Welcome to UO Today. I'm Steve Shankman, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guests today are Dr. Richard Sloan of Columbia University and Mark Unno of the University of Oregon's Department of Religious Studies. Richard Sloan is a professor of behavioral medicine at the New York Presbyterian Hospital, Columbia University Medical Center, and the chief of the Division of Behavioral Medicine at the New York State Psychiatric Institute. He earned his BS at Union College, his MA and his PhD at the New School for Social Research. His principal work focuses on links between psychological risk factors such as anxiety, depression, and hostility for heart disease. He is the author of Blind Faith, The Unholy Alliance of Religion and Medicine, published in 2006. Mark Unno is an associate professor of religious studies. His research interests include medieval Japanese Buddhism, modern Japanese religious thought, and Buddhism and psychotherapy. Mark Unno earned his BA at Oberlin and his MA and PhD at Stanford. He is the author of Buddhism and Psychotherapy Across Cultures, which he edited and which was published in 2006. Richard Sloan and Mark Unno are jointly presenting a discussion at the University of Oregon on the role of spirit in healing. And thank you both for being with us. We'll start with you, Richard, if you don't mind.
Fine.
Now, why did you undertake this project here, Blind Faith?
About 10 years ago or so, I became fairly incensed at the repeated media presentations of the putative benefits of religious practices on health outcomes, and the frequency of the commentaries, both in the print and broadcast media, and the uniformity of them just seemed to me to be too good to be true. And so I, along with a couple of colleagues, spent close to 2 years extensively reviewing the literature and culminating in a couple of publications that eventually led to the book.
So you felt that people were actually putting their lives at risk by believing in...
Well, some people are putting
or at least their health.
They're putting their lives at risk, putting their health at risk, and in other ways, the proponents at least were proposing to transform the way in which American medicine was practiced. They would claim, for example, that the future of medicine is prayer and Prozac. And they aimed, these are quotes, to tear down the wall of separation between religion and medicine. They proposed that all physicians should conduct a spiritual history at each new intake visit, and then annually thereafter a spiritual history, like a physical history or a social history. And in those histories they would ask questions about your prayer life, your religious and spiritual lives, things that are not traditionally conceived of as part of clinical medicine.
Well, let me ask you that, it appears as though over the last, 20 or 30 years, Western medicine has become more and more specialized. Is that not true? And that in the old days, I mean, my father was a GP. He used to say he'd go in to see his patients, and most of them had nothing wrong with them at all. And he used to speak with them, and then they would feel better. And somehow he seemed to have a kind of priestly or rabbinic role that was extremely important. And that seems to be gone today from physicians. So if not prayer or healing, what about that? What about the personal element? And maybe Mark, if you want to enter the conversation, we can come back to Richard.
Not having known of your work before and just looking at the title of the book, I had some kind of preconceived expectations, and as I had an opportunity to read through the book, I realized that there were many facets to your work, and of course we don't have the time to cover all the distinct aspects, but you cover a whole range of issues ranging from the very practical to the theoretical. So I just want to pick up on 4 or 5 of those points that I think are mentioned in your book. One of the points that I picked up, which is related to what Steve said, is that in today's world of medicine and HMOs, physicians and doctors do not have the time to engage in religious counseling and those kinds of issues. They need to really be focused on the medical care of their patients. Furthermore, related to that, they're not trained to counsel patients in religious matters. And in fact, seminaries and divinity schools specifically train chaplains for that purpose. And so they could work with those chaplains in coordinating their duties, but there should be a separation there. Furthermore, it seems you point out many instances of where attempts to link religious life, attendance at church or prayer with health effects is really not based on sound science. So an examination of bad science. That seems to be very important. And then related to all of this is this whole tendency that you identify to marry religion and medicine has certain problems for public policy, and so we need to be careful on those grounds. But the fifth point, which is related to but distinct from these previous 4 points, also seems to be equally important, which is that religion and the work of religious professionals, priests, rabbis, monks, nuns, what have you, you're not denigrating that. In fact, they have a very important function in the realm of religious meaning, but that's entirely separate from issues related to medicine. So those are some of the main points that I picked up that I think are very important. And from that, some questions occurred to me. A phrase that occurred in my mind is medicine and the spirit, never the twain shall meet. And that's kind of a sense that I got from much of your discussion, even though each has its separate realm of work that's very important. And in my work, in Buddhism and Asian thought, Asian philosophy, one of the questions we deal with is the relationship between mind and body and mind and matter. And there are at least 3 paradigms. One is that there are instances where they need to be treated completely separately, mind and body. Other realms in which we need to treat them as interactive. Mind can affect body, body can affect mind. And finally, there are certain systems and practices such as meditation where they need to be treated holistically. And does that have implications? So one thing I noticed is that much of the discussion in Asian thought is mind-body relations, not body-spirit relations, and that may also be a paradigm difference.
You can respond
well,
to
I appreciate, you obviously read the book very carefully, and I appreciate that. I can't say that about every interview that I've had. In fact, I can rarely say it about interviews. You pointed out that the quality of medicine as practiced by your father is very different from what we see today.
Yeah.
The amount of time that physicians have to spend with their patients and the reliance on technological medicine that characterizes contemporary American medicine. I think that's one of a number of reasons why the idea that religious practices are good for your health has caught on. To a great many people, it seems to be an antidote to the emphasis on technological contemporary medicine. But as in so many cases, you can find something that H.L. Mencken said that epitomizes this problem. Mencken said that for every complex problem, there's a solution that's simple, neat, and wrong. Mm-hmm. And in this case, the solution, bringing religious practices into medicine, may be simple and neat, but it's wrong. Right. What you really want is physicians to stop being jerks. Yeah. You want physicians to be nice people, to treat their patients as people and not as pieces of meat. Right. And that can be accomplished in any number of ways, and it doesn't require making the clinical interaction one that it revolves around religion and spirituality. Right. And that reminds me of your comment that religion and medicine and spirit never shall they meet. My concern is that they really have no business meeting in the clinical interaction. Patients have spiritual and religious concerns all the time, and I don't think anybody should dispute that. The real concern is when they become part of clinical medicine, and it's a bad idea for any number of reasons, several of which Mark identified. Physicians have no training, and moreover, they lack the time. The average length of a physician visit now is estimated to be between 7 and 19 minutes. If you, as some recommend, conduct a spiritual history that takes on average, as the estimates indicate, 4 minutes, you'll be consuming at least 20 minutes of that interaction, 20%, I'm sorry, 20% of that interaction with your physician. So what is the physician who's pressed for time to do absolutely everything not going to do because he's engaged in a spiritual disquisition
Right.
with the patient.
Yeah.
So you're not going to talk about depression, not going to talk about exercise, diet, nutrition, things we know are related to poor health.
Right. But of course, I think a lot depends on what you mean, again, by the spiritual condition. And so I wanted to ask you, how widespread do you think are the abuses in this practice that you're looking to? I mean, clearly, if you say, you know, you need to bring religious practice in, I mean, you know, religion is a very private thing, and lots of people don't do it, and they would feel that that would be somehow an imposition, and certainly physicians are not equipped to do that. But how widespread is this notion that somehow physicians are almost being forced to do something that they don't want to do?
Well, I don't know that they're being forced. I think that some of them are embracing it willingly. Until recently, we really had no good estimates about how prevalent the incursion of religion into medical practice is. But late last year, or no, I'm sorry, early this year, in a paper published in the New England Journal of Medicine by a physician and ethicist at the University of Chicago, we now have some information. The paper reported the results of a nationwide and nationally representative survey of physicians and asked a number of questions, including questions about conditions when a physician's religious pursuits may be inconsistent with the medical needs of the patient. And the medical needs of the patient may be satisfied by perfectly legal means. And the question for these respondents was, what would you do if you confronted a patient who wanted a perfectly legal medical procedure, but one that you found, because of your religious beliefs, objectionable? And 14%, which is 1 in 7, said not only would they not deliver the procedure, they also wouldn't inform the patient that such a procedure exists, and moreover, they wouldn't refer to somebody who delivered the procedure.
Right.
So that's...
So there is an incursion then, and
So there is an incursion.
And there is this feeling of people being forced to do something that they, I mean, at least patients being put in a position where they're denied information on the basis of religious conviction on the part of physicians.
And you know, one of the most central aims of being a physician is that you're supposed to address the needs of your patient, not yourself.
Right.
And that, for those 14%, that obviously isn't the case.
But just to kind of step back from a bit, and on balance, given the question I led off with today, and the feeling one gets that somehow physicians, I mean, and when people go into hospital, there doesn't seem to be very often somebody who's really in charge, you know, your doctor that has a whole view of who the person is. That this seems to be missing. And then, in fact, lots of medical schools now are stressing this kind of thing. In other words, trying to make doctors, you know, encourage them to be broader individual. So which problem is greater at the moment? The problem of very narrowly trained physicians who somehow are too narrow to deal with the needs of their patients, or this incursion of religion into medicine? Which do you think, or are they equal?
I guess they're equal. I really don't know which is more of a danger. They're both a real problem. And you're right. Medical schools, or at least many medical schools, have become acutely aware of the problem of physicians not addressing the humane concerns of their patients. So far as I can tell, there's been no parallel concern about the incursion of religious practices into medicine, at least at the institutional level.
Mark, did you have something to add
well,
to
this discussion just calls to mind the film some years back, The Doctor, starring William Hurt,
right.
And how, you know, he began to just see his patients as commodities, but that his personal experience with illness made him confront the fact that no, one is really before a whole human being. And that goes for, you know, many if not all professions, including my profession as a scholar, as a teacher. Students are not just, you know, tuition paying machines, but they're people. So that question seems to be distinct from the problem of the incursion of religion, but somewhat related in the sense that what do you do with the whole person whose life includes not just their physical condition, but their emotional state, and, you know, if they happen to have a religious orientation, their religious orientation. But as you suggest in your book, one venue for dealing with that is is to be working within a team that includes a medical chaplain or hospital chaplain who can address some of these issues. But as I suggested, maybe there's further frontiers that can be explored that you yourself have explored in terms of the mind-body relation, the relationship between depression and heart disease, and the different models, philosophical models that we have for mind-body relations. And is there a place for that? I don't know the answer, but is there a place for that to account for the function of what certain religionists call the spirit? And is there a way to address those in a kind of a scientific or philosophically responsible way?
My day job is to study the relationship between psychological factors and heart disease. And so I'm a firm believer in the relationship between mental events and physiological outcomes, and in the other direction as well. I think that has to inform the practice of medicine, but that doesn't in any way, I think, justify bringing religious practices into medicine, because there, in addition to the absence of any solid scientific evidence about the health benefits of religion, there are all sorts of practical problems, some of the ones we discussed, ethical problems, and even theological problems. I used to joke that anesthesiologists should never be allowed to speak to patients when they're conscious, because they have such a horrible manner that they don't treat their patients as people. They just treat them as recipients of anesthesia.
So let me ask you, though, obviously a patient has to request somebody to be a religious, to be on this team, somebody from some religious background. People can just request that.
Sure, patients probably more than half the patients in this country, which is to say more than half the people, have religious and spiritual concerns about medical matters, and that's absolutely fine. And the issue is not whether they have them or not. The issue is whether they can be resolved with physicians. And I'm a very big supporter of the work of healthcare chaplains. And one of the papers that we published in the New England Journal of Medicine was with 7 healthcare chaplains from a very broad range of denominations. I'm an enthusiastic supporter of addressing those concerns by professionals who have the training and the time to deal with them.
But don't you think, if you allow that so-called spiritual side to be taken up with denominational types, that it seems to me that if a physician just sort of feels like, okay, now I'm going to get the spiritual guy to come in here, it doesn't have to be necessarily a denominational, somebody from a particular faith or whatever. That wouldn't that expectation somehow lessen the sense of responsibility that I still have to deal with this whole person here? And if I'm going to deal with the so-called spiritual, whatever people mean by that, quote unquote, side of this person, I'm going to get the specialist to come in here and I'm just going to look at this body part or that body part.
I think that physicians aren't equipped to nor do they have the time to engage in these kinds of spiritual and religious interactions. They can recognize in the presence of the patient that this is something that's important to the patient, and then they can act accordingly and bring in the appropriate person in just the same way that a general practitioner, when he confronts somebody with complex heart disease, doesn't attempt to deal with it himself or herself, deals with it by referring to a cardiologist.
But again, maybe I didn't make my point clear enough, is that if you somehow feel the spiritual side, again, however you want to interpret that, doesn't have to be denominational religion, is going to be taken up by somebody else, then doesn't that sort of free you from the responsibility of thinking about that person in many dimensions? And you don't have to use spiritual in some sort of dogmatic, doctrinal, religious way, but wouldn't that, in a sense, just focus the physicians more on just looking at body parts and not at the whole person?
Not necessarily, because I would like, in ideal circumstances, the healthcare chaplain who comes in to offer religious or spiritual services is part of a clinical care team, and the members of that team talk to each other.
I think there's some kind of historical and practical sort of parameters that could be considered further, that depending on the time and place and previous generations, the the personal, cultural, and religious background of the attending general practitioner and the patient or client may not vary so much, so that in order for the physician to have the background and training that now a hospital or medical chaplain might need would not require nearly as much training as it does, given the diversity of the patient or the clientele, as well as sort of the time constraints. We don't really see, it doesn't pay to be a GP, we don't have the time for people to have that kind of extended, for example, it doesn't occur hardly anymore that doctors will visit home for, so that kind of thing. So it's also a time constraint thing. So the cultural conditions, it seems to me, we have to take into account, and how much. So I think that it seems like both concerns are important, that the specialization issue in all fields, not just medicine, causes a kind of a parochialism that can have a negative effect in many fields, but that there are practical parameters on how to address that parochialism, how to address the resources in terms of time and resources.
Well, in the 4 minutes or so that we have left, I wanted to bring up this issue, since this is one of your fields, that is of the result of behavior on physiology. What about studies, for example, such as Hal Roth is doing at Brown, on the physiological effects of meditative practice? Not necessarily, religious belief. It's not a question of faith or belief, but practice on, on, say, well, if you're doing this with heart, ways in which meditation techniques can have you?
Yeah, I've looked
I've
looked at the literature, and I'm sorry to say that at least to date, the literature on the health effects of meditation is pretty weak. That's not to say, in science you can never say that there is no effect. You can only say we don't have any evidence so far.
Right.
And by and large, the meditation studies that have been conducted suffer from many of the same methodological problems that the religion and medicine studies confront. There have been a few studies showing blood pressure lowering effects, chronic blood pressure lowering effects of meditative practices. Much of the meditation literature that exists so far shows acute effects of an episode of meditation, and that's interesting. But that doesn't tell you anything about whether there are any chronic health effects of meditative practice, a sustained practice of meditation.
Mark?
Yeah, and I think this is, in my area, Buddhism and psychotherapy, I think this is an emerging area. So there's so much we don't know yet. Better studies can be conducted of various kinds, and certainly related to some of your work related to things like depression. So maybe you might not have a direct correlation, but certainly depending on what kind of meditation or other religious practices might be involved, they can have an impact certainly on the mental health of a person greatly, and that can certainly have significant effects on the physical health of a person.
Right. I have to say that the work that we've done on religion and medicine and health has been restricted to physical health. And I can't really speak to the issue of the quality of the evidence or any of the other concerns.
So first, like blood pressure going down.
Blood pressure, heart disease, right. That I can tell you about, but I can't tell you about the quality of the evidence of religious practices on depression or anxiety or meditation.
I see. And what about the relation of depression and anxiety to heart disease?
I think that's extremely well established. Depression is absolutely well established as a risk factor for the development of heart disease and the exacerbation of existing heart disease.
So if meditation can help with depression, then it's going to help with...
That's another story. That's another story. It's not clear yet that treating the depression will have a beneficial impact on heart disease.
I see.
And that's because we lack evidence. There have been a couple of trials that have been inconclusive. So while there's a very well established relationship between depression and heart disease, in a prospective fashion, people who are depressed tend to develop heart disease at a greater rate than people who aren't depressed.
Right.
We don't know whether treating the depression is going to have an impact on heart disease.
And that seems to be one area of that's filled with methodological challenges, in the sense that once you bring the mind into play, then it's difficult to have the kind of double-blind controlled experiments that you can have in relation to objective science or objective medicine. And so it's not just that we have maybe bad science in certain cases, but how to explore that territory. And I guess the last comment that I would like to interject is that many of the Asian philosophies and traditions I study have, over the centuries, developed many ways to consider how to have a disciplined cultivation of the understanding of the relationship between mind and body. Mm-hmm. And it may not be on modern Western natural scientific terms, right, but there is a literature there and history of practices. Now, some of those practices may be problematic, but nevertheless, that's something that from the Western side we're just beginning to explore.
Yeah, I agree, and another qualification is that virtually all of the evidence, such as it is, on religion and health in the medical literature is devoted to Western religion.
Right. So we have an opening here,
yes,
and we'll talk again, I hope, in the future.
Okay.
Thank you both very much for being with us. And we've been speaking with Dr. Richard Sloan and with Mark Unno on a very, very interesting and timely topic of the relationship between spiritual life and physiological health. Thanks for watching.